The Jews under Persian rule. We need to talk a little bit about the rise of Media and Persia. We've already seen the Medians, or the Medes, if you will, on Sunday. They are involved with who? Anybody remember? We talked about them very briefly in regards to a battle at Carchemish. They were with Babylon. They joined the Babylonian coalition against the Assyrians. And so we see them then, and then kind of the highlight of world history turns over to the Babylonians for about 100 years until the Medes get together with another group of folks called the Persians, and they're going to be the next significant power. Both of these people, the Medes and the Persians, are Indo-European tribes that have their origins likely in the area of modern Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is in the news all the time now. But if you were to kind of go north of the area that we usually think of as the biblical lands, that's where these people likely originated. They migrated south into the area roughly of modern Iran today. But it's significant that they are Indo-European tribes. They are not ethnically related to most of the people that we usually think about being in the Middle East. Okay? Their language is also not Semitic. So it's not related to Hebrew. It's not related to some of the languages that we think about Old Testament period and languages that are being used. It's a different kind of language. Interestingly enough, and I'll just point this out, modern Persian is a descendant of ancient Persian. Modern Persian is written in Arabic script, so if you saw modern Persian written out, unless you can read Persian or Arabic, you wouldn't know that it was a different language. But it is a different language, and it's not related to Arabic. So it's not related to the languages even today that are all around it. It's its own language. And the people themselves are different in the ancient world, and we'll see that as we go through this class today. By the time they enter the Bible story, they are already centered in modern Iran. Okay, that's where they are by the time they become significant for what's going on in the Bible. They are east and northeast of Babylonia. We'll see a map in just a minute that'll help you to kind of see where they're located. They established a strong empire. It would last from 550 to 331 BC. That's 200 years plus change. 200 years plus change in the ancient world is a really long time for an empire to be around, all right? So they do establish a strong empire and one that's going to rule this area for a very long time. In fact, their empire was the largest empire in the ancient Near East up until this point in time, okay? There's going to be other empires that are going to be larger. Alexander is going to make an empire that is much larger than the Persian Empire. But up until this point in time, they conquer more territory and have the largest empire in that part of the world. The Persian Empire figures prominently in the Bible record, particularly in the books of Daniel, Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. All of those books are all set in part or entirely in the Persian period. Sorry for the typo there. Daniel, just the tail end of it. Esther, the entire book. Ezra, the entire book. Nehemiah, the entire book, are set during this period. So it's a significant period in biblical history. Okay, lots of stuff's happening among the Jews. We'll see that in a little while as well during this period. All right, so I promised you a map. Here it is. I'm going to have to turn around to use the laser pointer. So this area in purple is just what I want to point out. Everything that's within the red lines is the Persian Empire at its greatest extent. But this area in purple represents the territories that are gained by Cyrus. Okay? And then you add on to that, if you can read that legend up there, you add on to that this brown area over here, and then this green area down here. So if you add the brown, the purple, and the lighter green, and the darker green is their home territory anyways, that's all area that Cyrus adds to his empire. So Cyrus of Persia is their most significant king as far as expanding the borders of the empire. Significantly, of course, for us, for biblical studies, is that this is Israel, of course. There's Jerusalem, and they're added to the Persian Empire under Cyrus. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about him as well. Here's a photograph to share with y'all. A couple things to point out in this. There were two peoples in the empire, and they are both represented on this. If you will notice, you've got this guy with a very particular headdress. Okay, it almost looks like an Indian war bonnet. You have this guy over here that's got a different headdress. These are the Persians. these are the Medes. Okay, it was an empire that was formed of two different peoples, a coalition, if you will, and they're both represented in this particular artwork. So when you see individuals that are depicted in that way, you're looking at a Persian, and when you see someone looking that way, you're looking at a Mede. I might also point out that this symbol up here is a religious symbol from the Persian religion. The Persian religion was Zoroastrianism. That's a mouthful to say. At least in its early form. It's still in existence to today. And the result of that really is that the Persians tended to be very tolerant of other religious groups. Okay, and we'll see that also. All right, so another couple of photos to share with y'all. If you had to guess, and you're looking at that fellow there on the left, would you say Persian or Mede? Persian, you'd be correct. If you look at the fellow on the right, not enough information. He's a Persian, okay? It's a Persian archer. Let's get our mic there. Tom?
That was the question. Stacy said the slides aren't advancing on the broadcast.
Okay, so Tom, I'm going to need you to say that into Caleb's mic right there because I can't hear it.
The slides aren't advancing on the broadcast. It's stuck on the title slide. Your audio's okay. That's what I'm saying.
Jordan acknowledges that message. And beyond that, I can do nothing because I can't do anything with what's going on in there. They're advancing here, so thank you, Tom, for pointing that out. All right. So father is Persian, mother is Median. Cyrus actually leads a rebellion against his grandfather. Who would his grandfather have been? Astyages. That's why I wanted you to remember that, okay? His grandfather is Astyages of Media. He leads a rebellion against him so that he can be on the throne. The final battle is fought at a place called Pasargadae, and it was fought in about 550 BC. So you've got Cyrus going out to battle with his army. You've got Astyages, who's his grandfather, going out to battle with his army. Cyrus wins the battle, and Herodotus, who's a Greek historian, tells us this. He says, as for Astyages, Cyrus did him no further harm. I've defeated your army, I've removed you from the throne, but I'm not going to harm you. And kept him in his own house until Astyages dies. Now that's a grandson to really want, right? Well, steal the throne from you, I'm going to defeat your army, but that's okay, you can come live with me until you die. It's interesting, at any rate, to note that. It's kind of unusual because in the ancient world you would have expected Cyrus to do what? Kill him, okay? Because, you know, that's potentially someone who's going to come back later and get me for what I did. All right, so he's half Persian, half Median. He conquers Lydia in Asia Minor. If you remember that map, it was the dark brown area that's in modern Turkey. In 539 BC, the city of Babylon falls, and that event is recorded in Daniel chapter 5. So if you read the very end of Daniel chapter 5, you get the fall of the city to the Persians. Daniel chapter 6 is already set in the Persian period. Okay, the Persians are already in control. Who is that last king? Anybody remember? In Daniel chapter 5, he's having a party. He gets the handwriting on the wall. Belshazzar. Belteshazzar is Daniel, so it's Belshazzar, okay? Easy to make that mistake, right, with these names. Belshazzar is the king, and he's having the wild party. That night, the city falls. It's very interesting how the city falls, but we're probably not going to get into that in this class. Okay, so this is a photograph of the ruins of Persepolis. I just want you to kind of get a feel for how extensive that is. We sometimes think of ancient nations like they were just dirt poor, didn't have anything, a bunch of hillbillies out in the sticks, right? That's a significant city. Those are the ruins that have been uncovered, all right? This is also from Persepolis. These are the monumental stairs in Persepolis. So to give you an idea of the size, I'll have to turn around again. You can see the statues that are up there. These are the stairs that are going up, and those ant-like looking creatures are people going up the stairs. So this is monumental architecture that is built by the Persian Empire. Okay, they are a powerful empire. Let's talk a little bit about Cyrus and the Jews. So there are some prophecies concerning Cyrus. If you'll take your Bibles, we are going to look at some Bible verses. Let's go over to Isaiah chapter 44 and verse 28. We're going to read that, and then immediately chapter 45 and verse 1. We'll read a little bit. We're not going to read the whole chapter. So Isaiah 44 and verse 28, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he shall fulfill all my purpose, saying of Jerusalem, she shall be built, and of the temple your foundation shall be laid. So here we have a prophecy in Isaiah that is about 150 years before the time of Cyrus. And the prophecy says that Cyrus is going to fulfill God's plan for the Jews, specifically saying that Jerusalem is going to be rebuilt and the temple is going to be, the foundation is going to be laid. Verse 1 of chapter 45, thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped, to subdue nations before him, and to loose the belts of kings, to open doors before him, that gates may not be closed. I will go before you and level the exalted places. I will break in pieces the doors of bronze and cut through the bars of iron. I will give you the treasures of darkness and the hoards in secret places, that you may know that it is I, the Lord, the God of Israel, who call you by your name. For the sake of my servant Jacob and Israel my chosen, I call you by my name. I name you, though you do not know me. So what Isaiah 45 is telling us is that God is raising Cyrus up to fulfill his purpose. And Cyrus doesn't know who the Lord, the God of Israel is, but God knows who he is. And so God is accomplishing his purpose in him in making sure that it is going to be Cyrus then who's going to be on the throne when the time, and the Persian Empire is going to be ruling when it's time to send the Jews back home. Okay. I note this because we're used to looking at this in the context of Daniel, of what God is doing in the kingdoms of men. It's not just a Daniel thing. Isaiah talks about it as well. This is God arranging things. God is putting his plan for his people and ultimately for the Messiah into action through his providence. And, well, we don't need to leave out miracles because there's nothing that would preclude miracles. Certainly in the book of Daniel, you see some pretty miraculous things happening. Let's go over here with the mic to Aaron.
So the word here is actually Messiah. God used that term for like 3 or 4 people ever, and he calls Cyrus his Messiah. Which
he does.
Is interesting.
That is the word anointed there in verse 1 of chapter 45. Okay. All right, so again, there are prophecies about him. It's 150 years, over 150 years before the actual reign of Cyrus. So Cyrus isn't even born yet. And God is already saying through Isaiah, it's going to be Cyrus who accomplishes his purpose. Cyrus ends up dying in battle near the Aral Sea in July of 530 BC. We do read about a decree concerning the Jews. Let's read this. It's Ezra chapter 1. Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides free will offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. All right, what's interesting about this decree is that we get some archaeological evidence that it doesn't confirm this decree, but it confirms the concept of the decree. This takes place in the first year of Cyrus's reign in Babylon. It's 538 BC. Okay, we all know that we date the return of the Jews to what year? Not 538. 536, okay? 536 is when they actually hit the road. Because when the decree goes out, they've got to get things together. Because how long have the Jews now been living in Babylon? 70 years, okay? And so some of them are going to go back and they're going to make preparations for that, and they're actually going to go back. But the decree is made in 538 BC. The first group then returns in 536 BC, okay? And when you take 605, which is the beginning of the captivity, the first group goes. Who's in that group? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and others. And you go forward to 536. How many years do we get? It's 70 years. Okay, it's 70 years inclusive of those two dates. So that's the end of the Babylonian captivity. God raises Cyrus up to do that. Cyrus's view of things on the world stage is different than the Babylonians. Quite honestly, can you imagine Belshazzar from Daniel chapter 5 letting the Jews go home? It's inconceivable that he would do that. There's my Princess Bride word, okay? It's inconceivable that he would do that because that's just not who Belshazzar was. Cyrus comes on the scene. Cyrus is completely different, okay? And God has raised him up for that purpose. And so he's going to let the Jews go home, among others. This is the Cyrus cylinder. You can see that if you go to the British Museum. That's where it's housed today. This particular cylinder, I'm going to pull up the inscription. Part of it says this: I returned to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which had been ruins for a long time, the images which used to live therein, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned to them their habitations. This was a state policy of the Persians. The Babylonians had moved people around. They conquer somebody, we move them around. The Assyrians had done that as well. The Persians come on the scene and they say, these people aren't happy living somewhere where they don't want to live. And their gods are not happy because their temples are destroyed and the people that worship those gods are not there to worship them. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to let people go home. Everybody go home if you want to. When you get there, rebuild whatever temple it is of whatever god it is you're worshiping so that prayers will be said on my behalf. Okay? Cyrus is interesting in ancient history, okay? The Persians are interesting in ancient history because they do something different. Usually ancient people said, if we conquered you, that meant that my God was stronger than your God. That's why Belshazzar, when he's having that drunken feast, he calls for the temple instruments from Jerusalem to be brought in so that everybody can drink wine out of them. He's profaning those objects because he doesn't care. Because whatever God of Israel there is, we beat them. Cyrus comes along and says, everybody's God is good. So whoever you are, go home, worship your gods, and of course pray for me and pray for the empire. And so there's going to be a shifting of people around. Temples are going to be rebuilt. That cylinder, by the way, is a foundation cylinder. That was never meant for public display. It was buried in the foundation of a building. All right. However, in the British Museum, they recently deciphered 2 tablets, fragments, that were the same inscription. They weren't a cylinder. They were meant to be displayed on a wall. So this was public state policy of the Persians to send people back to their original homelands so that they could build. It's interesting to me as you look at our text here in Ezra that when Cyrus sends them back, there's an interesting little statement there in verse 4. Let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides free will offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. What does that remind you of? Exodus, exactly. It should remind us that when the Jews come out of Egypt, they tell all their neighbors, give us gold. And what do the Egyptians do? They give them gold. And so the text says they plundered the Egyptians on their way out. It was, in a sense, wages for the labor that they had done in Egypt. These folks are captive now in the Persian Empire, and as they go back, you can, get stuff from the other people around you as you're going back. It's not as strong as what happens in the Exodus, but it is most definitely reminiscent of it. All right. So that's the Cyrus cylinder. If you're in London, hit the British Museum and you can see it there. This is the tomb of Cyrus. It's at Pasagati, modern Iran. That's where you got to go. Don't go there today. But if you wanted to go there, that's where you'd have to go. You'd have to go to Iran to see it. The tomb is empty. You notice that open door in the front of it. His body was stolen long ago and the tomb was plundered. But this is the inscription that was written on it. You there, I am Cyrus, son of Cambyses, who founded the Persian Empire and reigned as king of Asia. Do not begrudge me my monument. That's what's recorded as having been on his tomb. Again, it's empty today, but it was there in the ancient world, and people could see that and recognize that indeed Cyrus was Cyrus the Great, because he was, as a king. All right, he is followed on the throne by Darius the First, who is also called the Great. He was a member of the Persian royal family, but not the son of Cyrus. Okay, it's not Cyrus's son, but he is from the Persian royal family. He becomes the next king. He ascended to the throne after overthrowing a fellow whose name was Bardia, who had usurped Cambyses' throne. So this guy's a little bit of a mystery, but Darius gets rid of him and puts the right family back on the throne again in the Persian Empire. Darius reigns from 522 to 486 BC. That's not too shabby. That's a nice little reign as well. He does die of natural causes, which in the ancient world, any king who gets to die of natural causes, that's a good thing because a lot of them didn't. So he dies of natural causes in 486 BC. He is most famous historically because the Ionian revolt took place during his reign, and that is the subject of the next class. Because we're going to have to get from the Persians to the Greeks, and it starts in Ionia. Anybody know where Ionia is today? Or where it was in the ancient world? It's in Turkey. It's that western seacoast of Turkey. And everything that happens between the Persians and the Greeks is because of that. That takes place, that Ionian revolt takes place during the reign of Darius I. This is the palace of Darius at Persepolis. By the way, if you're looking at these photos and saying, hey, those are really, really neat. Did you go to Iran? No, I did not go to Iran. I have no desire to go. Well, I do. I do have a desire to go to Iran. I do not have a desire to go to Iran under the current regime. But a couple of fellows that do some really, really good CDs of Bible lands did go to Persia as Americans. They took a lot of photos and put them together. And I'm very indebted for that because it's really hard to find good photos of sites in Iran because the Iranians don't let a whole lot of folks into their country who would make Bible CDs. So this is the palace of Darius at Persepolis. This is the tomb of Darius, also at Persepolis. It's up there in that cliff rock face, there in the background. Okay, so right up there is his tomb. Significant king. All right, so we've got a question here. I'm sorry, I missed it.
In the current Iranian regime, which is a Muslim-run government, very strict, how do they feel about any of these old biblical, do they leave it alone or do they have a...
They do. They actually... They don't tear these things down. Modern Iranians are Persians. They are very proud of their history, and for good reason. Okay, regardless of the difficulties, that's a light word, between our nations today, they are the descendants of these people. And they are very proud of that cultural heritage, and so they preserve these things. Interestingly enough, back when ISIS was a thing, and they're not much of a thing now, but they were for a while, not in Iran, but in other places, they were demolishing things. They were demolishing anything that was pre-Islamic.
That's what I was wondering.
So that would not have flown very well in Iran because the Iranians preserve these things. I mean, you see all those people that are visiting the sites. Those are 99.9% Iranians that are visiting those places.
Their leaders are Muslim leaders, though.
They are.
Persian, too?
Yes.
What are they, not the Shah? What's he called now? Ayatollah?
Well, the Ayatollah is a religious leader, but yeah, they're all Persians. Okay.
So they've melded the two, whereas...
Islam is a religion. Persian is an ethnicity.
But they've melded, they're okay with having this religion, this ethnicity that are...
Well...
Where you say like ISIS tears it down because they only see the Muslim side of things.
Their
Muslim side.
Their modern equivalent to the iconoclasts of the past, where certain religious groups would go into a church and destroy all the images.
That's what, yeah.
Okay, but that's an extremist view. You don't see that. There are other extremist views in Iran, but that's not one of them. They preserve these cultural monuments because it's a part of their history. It's a part of their culture, and they're proud of it. And rightfully so. I mean, the Persian Empire was an incredible empire. Yeah.
That was what I was trying to say.
Gotcha. All right. So, Darius the First and the Jews. The work on the temple in Jerusalem had been halted since 536 BC. We read about that in Ezra chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. I'll just note that. You can read that on your own, all right? But They go back, the Jews go back, they begin to build a temple, and it gets halted. There's a whole lot of stuff that goes on about that. If you studied, let's see, Mark, I think, just taught that period. If you studied that class, there's probably a lot of talk about that in that class. But it had been halted. So no more work on the temple. Work begins again in 520 BC. So how long is the period with no work on the temple? 16 years. Okay, you're counting backwards. 536 to 520, 16 years. So the work begins again in 520. That's recorded in Ezra chapters 5 and 6. Again, we're not going to read that in the class. You have it in your notes. You can read those chapters later. But they're looking, the Jews are claiming, we have permission to build this. The opponents are saying, no, you don't. So they send back. We need to find out, is there permission or not? And indeed, when they do a search, they find a copy of the decree. That's recorded in Ezra chapter 6, verses 2 and following. The decree was found in Ecbatana, which was another city in the Persian Empire, in the archives. So they go, they do a search, and guess what? The temple is supposed to be rebuilt. So leave the Jews alone. Let them rebuild the temple. The work was not to be hindered. Ezra 6, verse 11 tells us that. The temple then is finished in 516 BC. Ezra chapter 6 and verse 15. All of this is under the reign of Darius. All right. Cyrus sends them back, says build the temple. And then because of things that are going on, the temple doesn't get built. And now it's time to build the temple again. By the way, God sends 2 prophets to get the Jews going on this. Anybody know who they are? Not Nehemiah. Not Micah. Who are our 2 prophets?
Zechariah is one of them.
Zechariah and Haggai. Okay, Zechariah and Haggai. So we have their writings, don't we? They're in the minor prophets. All right. So one of their purposes. Zechariah's got several purposes. Haggai is really about rebuilding the temple. So God says, "Hey, this is not acceptable. You're supposed to build the temple. Get the temple built." And so they do, and the temple is finished in 516 BC, which is then 20 years after they had gone back to Israel. That's all under the reign of Darius. All right, our next king that we consider in Persia is a fellow whose name is Xerxes. If you will look in your Bibles and try to find Xerxes, you will look high and low and not find Xerxes, because that's not what he's called in the Bible. We'll get to that in a second. He is the son of Darius the First. Okay, so the kingdom passes from Darius the First to his son. Does Darius first die of natural causes or in battle? He dies of natural causes. Xerxes then assumes the throne. He reigns from 485 to 465 BC. He is mentioned in Ezra chapter 4 and verse 6. So let's look at that. Ezra chapter 4 and verse 6, and we will get his name. And then we'll look at another text that also has his name. And as soon as I try to read this out loud, you will know why I call him Xerxes. And in the reign of Ahasuerus. That's really hard to say. And if it's in more than one sentence, it's really hard to say. In the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. Okay? This is Xerxes. Xerxes is an English name, comes from the Greek. That's what they called him, and so our name comes from that. Ahasuerus is probably much closer to what his name would have been in Persian, but that's the Hebrew equivalent or phonetic equivalent of his name. And so that's what he's called in the Bible. I call him Xerxes. I will keep calling him Xerxes. I will always call him Xerxes because it is so much easier to pronounce. All right. His name in Esther, there we have it. I know you have it on the papers. There's no surprising y'all when I let you have the papers in advance. Is Ahasuerus, exactly like it is in Ezra chapter 4 and verse 6. The entire book of Esther is set in Susa. Okay? And I'm going to have some photos of that in just a moment. That entire book. So you think about the story of Esther, it's all in Susa. That's where it all takes place. And Xerxes is the king that's in question there. However, if you go outside the Bible, Xerxes is probably the most famous for the invasion of Greece in 480 BC. Remember the Ionian revolt? That happens under Darius. That happens under Dad. Okay? The Persians are none too happy about this because Ionia is a part of the Persian Empire. And so Xerxes is going to finish what Dad didn't. I always say there is a parallel here, and nobody get mad at me for saying this. This is George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr. Okay? George Bush Sr. didn't get to do exactly what he wanted to do in Iraq. George Bush Jr. got to. Okay? Darius didn't get to do what he wanted to the Greeks. Xerxes will take care of that. Or, well, he'll try to take care of that, and he will take care of that to a large extent. That's what he's famous for. So if you study Greek history, you study Xerxes, you read about the invasion of Greece. Very significant. We will talk about that as well in this class. Xerxes is killed in a palace plot in 465 BC. So that's the end of Xerxes. Here is the excavations or the remains of the royal palace at Susa. I realize that is really, really small print, but just point out some things here that are significant in the books that we read that are placed here. We have the Apadana, which is the audience hall. If you want to see the king, that's where you would go. That's where he usually would hold public audiences, okay? Then you have an outer courtyard, a middle courtyard, and an inner courtyard. Here are the remains of the king's quarters, and here are the women's quarters. Okay, this has all been archaeologically excavated. It is in Iran today, and yes, the Iranians are very proud of these excavations because it is their cultural history. Read the book of Esther and look at that picture when you do. And notice the statements that are made in the book of Esther that we tend to just gloss over. Mordecai went here, Mordecai went there. And look at that picture, okay? This is the place where the story of Esther took place. Lots of times in biblical archaeology, things are traditional. So if you go to Jerusalem today and you do a tour of Jerusalem, you're going to hear things from if you go with Barry Brittenell or Farrell Jenkins, you're not going to hear this. You're probably not going to hear this. But if you go with a tour operator who's really about tourism, he'll say, this is where Jesus stumbled while he was carrying the cross. Well, no, it's not. Okay, it might be about 10 feet under there, but it's not exactly right there. When you see these places, this is where Esther took place. So when you read about the courtyards and the king's quarters, this is where it happened. Okay, this has all been excavated and noted, and the book of Esther gives us so many details of that it brings the story to life. Okay, another photograph, same thing. It's the royal palace in Susa. You have the throne room right here. The king's quarters, we're zoomed in, if you will. The Apadana is way over there. The inner courtyard here, and you have the royal gardens. Again, read the book of Esther with where Xerxes goes when he's mad. What happens with Mordecai? What happens with Esther? What happens with Haman? Read all of that and take a look at that picture. Okay, you can see where all of this is happening. Again, barring any changes in the Middle East, you just have to look at pictures instead of going on your own. All right, so that's Xerxes. Let's talk about Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes the first is the son of Xerxes by Amestris. Amestris is Vashti of the book of Esther. We remember her story, right? King's having a drunken feast. He demands that Vashti comes in. Vashti says, no. So now Xerxes has got a problem because his wife defied him right in front of all these nobles, and what am I going to do about that? And so he ends up deposing Vashti and making Esther the queen instead, eventually. All right? Vashti is not killed. She's just sent back to the harem. She's demoted. Okay, there's lots of women in the harem. Remember the contest to see who's going to replace Vashti. Each woman goes into Xerxes for one night. And if Xerxes doesn't choose her to be the next queen, where does she go? Back to the harem. She doesn't get to go home. She's stuck in the harem, which admittedly might not have been a bad life in the ancient world to be in the king's harem because they were well taken care of there. I don't know whether I would have appreciated that at the time, but at any rate, Esther ends up becoming the queen. Vashti is Amestris. Amestris, in spite of being deposed, actually provides the son that is going to be the next king on the throne. That tells us that Amestris is going to have probably significant power. Okay, because her son is the king. All right. So again, the son of Xerxes. These kings would have had a lot of sons, probably, because they have all these concubines. And a concubine gets pregnant, that's the son of the king. It's not the heir, but it's the son of a king. All right. So that's Artaxerxes. He reigns from 464 to 424. Do the math real quick. How long is that? It's 40, right? If I'm counting that right, I hope I can do the math. 40 years. That's a long time to reign as a king. Okay, that's a significantly long reign. The Persian Empire had a lot of stability because of that, because the king doesn't change frequently. There's a lot of stability. So he reigns from those years. Ezra returns to Judah in about 458 BC. That's in Ezra chapter 7, verses 7 and 8. Who's the king? Artaxerxes I is the king. Okay, so it's in his reign that Ezra ends up going back to Judah. Then we have Nehemiah. Nehemiah is Artaxerxes' cupbearer. Let's read Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 1, and also chapter 2 and verse 1. The words of I'll give you time to find that, sorry. I'm talking really fast. All right, so Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 1, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev in the 20th year, as I was in Susa, the citadel. Okay, so remember the photos of Susa? That's the city where Nehemiah is. All right, look at chapter 2 and verse 1. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that is Artaxerxes I, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. Artaxerxes has a cupbearer. The cupbearer is none other than Nehemiah. Now, we would look at that, maybe without understanding the situation, we'd say, oh, well, he's just a servant. Oh, no. Nehemiah is a trusted servant. Because one of the best ways to kill a king is poison. Okay? It was like, I think in Victorian England, the favorite poison was arsenic. Everybody was getting killed by arsenic because it couldn't be traced very well. And it was easy to poison someone because it doesn't taste like anything, I guess. I don't know. I've never tasted it, but apparently that's so. Well, in the ancient world, if you wanted to get rid of a king, poison him. So the kings would have people who would taste the food. And if they didn't croak, the king could eat or the king could drink. And that's the position that Nehemiah had. Well, that means you really had to trust the guy, because if there's a palace plot going on and they get the cupbearer involved in that, then the cupbearer could probably fake it some way and make sure the king dies. So Nehemiah is a very well-trusted, close right-hand man of Nehemiah. And I think that's clear when you read the book of Nehemiah, the relationship between these two men. Okay, in 444 BC, again, Artaxerxes is the king. The walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt. All right, so some pictures here. These are Persian rhytons. A rhyton is a drinking cup. Okay, it's a fancy word from the Greek for a drinking cup. And they are made of gold. That one up there on the top is silver. That's just gold plating, right? Oh no, that's solid gold. So think about that when you go home tonight and you're drinking out of your plastic cup or glass or whatever. Or if you have a picnic and you're drinking out of a red Solo cup, that if you had been the king of Persia, you would have drunken out of a gold drinking cup. And it might have been looking like a horse down there in the bottom left, or like a sphinx there in the middle, or like that cow. It's not a cow. I can't remember the exact word for it, but it's a kind of cattle that lived in the ancient Near East. Or it might have looked like that sheep up there, or the silver one is in the form of a goat. Okay, because if we're going to make a gold cup, we're at least going to make it look pretty, right? And so they did. And so drink would be brought to the king by the cupbearer, and as we'll see in a minute in a quote, he would drink it first. He would drink from it first, okay? To make sure it wasn't poisoned, make sure nobody had poisoned it in giving it to the cupbearer. It was a kind of a dangerous position. It's like being a Secret Service agent, right? Secret Service agents are supposed to do what? They're supposed to take the bullet, okay? So the president or the vice president doesn't. That's what they're supposed to do. All right, so this is another rhyton. It's made out of silver and gold. Xenophon wrote this in his work about Cyrus. He said, now it is a well-known fact that the cupbearers, when they proffer the cup, draw off some of it with the ladle, pour it into their left hand and swallow it down, so that if they should put poison in it, they may not profit by it. So they don't drink from the cup. That would be gross, right? They get it in a ladle and they drink it. And it's done before the king, so the king knows, okay, all right, it's good to drink. Okay, subsequent kings, of Persia. 8 more kings are going to rule during the period 424 to 329. When finally then Alexander the First, the Great, okay, who is Macedonian but culturally Greek, will defeat Persia. Okay? We'll talk all about that. Almost all of these 8 kings were descended from Darius the First. The final decisive battle was fought at Gaugamela in 331 BC. You'll notice the discrepancy in the dates there. The battle is fought in 331 BC, but the last Persian king is going to run away for a while, and he's going to escape for a little while until finally, 2 years later, he's killed. Okay. Again, Persia is not completely conquered until 329 BC. All right, so overall assessment. As we look at the Jews under Persian rule, the Jews remained under Persian control for the entire existence of the empire. They're going to pass from Persian control to the control of who? Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire. Okay, it was a relatively prosperous and peaceful period for the Jews. So think about this. The decree goes out at the beginning of Cyrus's reign. Go home. What do all the Jews do? Some go, a whole lot stay. So some go, we want to go back to Jerusalem. We want to go back to Judah. It's the promised land. Okay, we want to go back there. So they do. Then there's a whole lot of other Jews that don't. So 538 is when the decree is given. Remember our dates for Esther. And remember our dates for Nehemiah and Ezra. Those dates are almost 100 years later. And the Jews are still, or a lot of them are still in Persia. Not only are they in Persia, but Esther becomes the queen of Persia. Nehemiah becomes the cupbearer to Artaxerxes I. Not only are they living in Persia, they are prospering in Persia. Okay? So compared to other world empires, the Jews actually do pretty well. When you think about what happens in the book of Esther with the threat against the Jews, that threat's not carried out. And in fact, it's turned opposite so that the enemies of the Jews are the ones that actually get hurt in that. Okay? So they do fairly well during this period. So well that many of them just don't go back. Remember last class, we talked about the fact that up until 1948, there were about 100,000 Jews living in what would be modern Iraq. Now there are about 100, probably less than that by now. Okay, so in the past, they stuck around because it was not a bad place to be. Daniel, Mordecai, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah all played important roles during this period. We leave out Daniel. I shouldn't have. He's important, right? What happens in Daniel chapter 6? Okay, and that all happens because he is in a high position in the empire. All right, so they're all significant in the period. All right, just a timeline. This is just for y'all to have, and then we're going to wrap up the class. Cyrus, 559 to 530. Significant, 536, the first group returns. Cambyses the second, relatively short reign. Darius the first reigns 522 to 486. Significant in his reign is the temple being rebuilt, 520 to 516. Then we have Xerxes, 485 to 465, significant as well. We have the events of Esther. Okay, we'll talk more in depth about that later in the class. Then we have Artaxerxes, 464 to 424. Ezra returns in 458. Nehemiah then rebuilds the walls in 444. Right. So that is it. Any questions before that second bell rings? Questions or comments? Hopefully I didn't give you all a headache tonight. Hopefully not. You have a question?
Yeah, I did have a question. When did they start digging through the royal palace? Like, what year was that?
When did they I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. My suspicion would be that some of the excavations took place before there was a modern state of Iran.
Right.
Because these areas probably were somewhat ruled or influenced by European powers early on. But they're definitely being preserved and expanded today under the modern state of Iran.
Got it.
Any other questions? All right, so if you will look at your sheets, tell me, what are we going to talk about Sunday morning? I don't have a sheet here. Tell me, what are we going to look at? What's our next topic? Persia and Greece. All right, very good. All right, thank you all very much.